Welcome to Fintech Insider Insights from 11FS. I'm Benjamin Ensor, and today we're cutting through the hype to talk about agentic payments. Agentic payments are not a new way to pay, but a shift in who makes the decision to pay. So instead of making a payment yourself, you're telling an AI system what you want, and it figures out the rest. It decides when to transact, who to transact with, and potentially even how much to pay. So that's a fundamental change from executing transactions to delegating intent. Now, we've had delegated payments before, subscriptions, direct debits, but those are very predictable. What's different here is that the decision itself is being done by an AI agent. And that starts to challenge some, maybe many, of the core assumptions that payments are built on, that a human initiates, authenticates, and is ultimately accountable. So what happens when that's no longer true? What does authorization mean? And where does responsibility sit? So that's what we're here to explore in this podcast. And joining me to unpack what's real and what's hype, and what comes next in agentic payments, is a panel of three fantastic guests. So let's meet them. So first up, we have Rory O'Neill, CMO at checkout.com. Rory, it's fantastic to have you with us. Can you give our listeners a quick introduction to you and to checkout.com, please?
Hi there. Great to be on this panel and talking about agentic commerce, which the industry has spent a lot of time talking about over recent months, for sure. And we at Checkout. So Checkout's a digital payments business operating globally. We process around 300 billion or more of e-commerce transactions today. We're super excited and believe that agents buying on the consumer's behalf will open a world of opportunities to merchants as for yet another channel in digital commerce, and it will offer consumers just a great experience for what they want to delegate to agents as they continue in their commerce world. But I think what we're all working through together, and great to get into the discussion with the panelists today, is how we innovate and how we build trust in that agentic system so it can operate like the digital commerce that we know and understand and even trust today.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. And next, I'm delighted that we are being joined by Sahar Attaripour, an investor and advisor. Welcome to the show. We'd love if you would also tell us a little bit about your background and the kind of investments and firms that you advise.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is a super interesting topic to discuss, and there is so much to do still about it. I started my career in consulting post-MBA for near a decade, and I got tired of advising people and not actually getting the job done or seeing it through. So I started my own fintech company in 2016, which was funnily enough, a fully automated AI-driven investment decision-making machine. And I built it and sold it to Bernstein in 2022. Joined them as a part of the acqui-hire, was part of the hedge fund solutions team at Bernstein for 2 years. And since I left in 2024, I have started investing myself. So I have created my own portfolio, which is entirely industry agnostic. I've got 2 fintech companies in my portfolio, but I also advise other financial institutions, including private banks, fintechs, and many other businesses at different sizes. And what is, generally speaking, my interest and what I spend most of my time doing is to look at most of the things that we do at the meta layer from the top and try to see how we have to reimagine and redesign solutions and processes. Because as you all know today, nothing looks like what it did even a year ago. And it's only getting faster and faster, and this change is just the beginning of it. So it's very interesting to discuss agentic commerce and agentic payments as part of that, because the part that the technology is ready to do and the part that we can take advantage of and do something with, it's useful and it's doable. There's a huge gap between the two, and it's super exciting to talk about what can be done and what are the opportunities.
It certainly is. So welcome. And I'm also delighted to welcome Sam Boboev, founder of Fintech Wrap Up. Sam, it's great to have you back, especially given your recent deep dives into agentic commerce on Substack and on FinExtra. For people who haven't come across you before, can you give us a little bit of an introduction, please?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Benjamin. My name is Sam. I'm the founder of Fintech Wrap Up, analytics and media platform. Also, the founder of a Wrap Up podcast, where I cover developments around payments, agentic commerce, agentic payments, banking, and everything around it. So it's great to be on the show.
Wonderful. Thank you, all three. Okay, well, let's start with the absolute basics for listeners who haven't come across sort of agentic payments before. Sam, perhaps I can start with you. What are agentic payments? How do they work?
Well, Benjamin, I would define agentic payments as a payment where I do not decide the transaction, rather I define the intent. For example, instead of me choosing the merchant, the amount and timing, I usually set the goals like book me the cheapest flight or buy my favorite coffee, and an agent makes the payment decision within those boundaries, basically. Well, I would say under the hood, nothing changed in terms of rails. It still runs on cards, bank transfers, or real-time payments. What changed is the decision layer. The agent selects when to pay, who to pay, and how to route the payment. So basically, agentic payments are not a new way to move money. They are this shift from user-initiated transaction to basically system-initiated decision-based or predefined intent, I would say.
Thank you. Rory, it sounds simple enough in principle, but there's some complexity behind the scenes to enable it, right? So if you haven't got a person initiating the transaction, right, what changes from your perspective as a PSP? What has to happen differently, if anything, behind the scenes?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately, it's the trust model, right? Like, so when we make payments online, we need to know who the buyer is. We need to know what they're buying. We need to know that we've got money in the account to pay for the goods and services that they buy online. And all of the trust models that we've built over since the birth of e-commerce now have to be updated for a very simple principle change, that it's not the human anymore or the physical buyer, making the transaction. It's an agent. So as Sam said, it's delegated authority. So instead of know the customer, it's know the agent. How do we identify agents? How do we know what permissions the agents have? And when purchases are made and things need to be refunded, who's liable? How do we manage reverse logistics? How do we manage refunds? How do we know that the agent has permission to buy for a certain amount or a certain price point? All of these questions that we've answered in the trust model of digital commerce now have to be re-engineered and rethought about, so that as we move from using AI for discovery into using AI and agents for purchase, we know exactly the identity of the agent, we know what permissions they have, so that we can actually conduct commerce. And that's the bit that the industry is working through, Benjamin.
Indeed. Sahar, is there a difference, do we think, between buyers who are consumers, sort of retail customers, and buyers who are businesses? Do we think that we might see agentic sort of payments and agentic commerce more widely being adopted faster by businesses or by consumers? Because when people think about agentic commerce, you sort of tend to think in terms of, someone booking a flight and, the agent goes off and finds you lots of different flights. But is that actually maybe where this is going to start? Or is it actually going to be businesses, doing repeat orders of, supplies or whatever that might move faster? What do you think?
I think there are multiple components to agentic commerce. And at the end of it, the agentic payments, that some of them are simpler in the case of business purchases. They are, in some sense, a lot closer to a direct debit or a standing order because, like, for example, it's a resupply of something from a list of vetted suppliers and providers, or the restrictions and the parameters of this decision could be a lot more well defined, and they are, generally speaking, a lot better documented, as opposed to where you talk about a human interacting with an agent and delegating their agency to an AI agent in order to go through the rest of the process, do the browsing, the selection, the negotiations, the payment, and until the delivery of the task that you have asked them to do. A lot of things are very nuanced. Humans have a very bizarre way of explaining what they want, and generally speaking, they can't even say what they want very explicitly and in words. And there is a very, I would say, thin line between an agent that because I was thinking about the process of what would be the best UX for the human in order to tell the agent in the most accurate way what to go and buy and what are the characteristics of this thing that they want. But the thing is that we think about things sometimes in a lot more simpler ways and sometimes in a lot more like there are a lot of feelings involved. There are things that cannot be really put in words. And if the agent goes and then, similar to the chain of thoughts that you see in some of the LLM models, comes back and says, okay, I did this thinking and these are the parameters and the properties of this decision that I have to make that are missing, and asks you all of these questions. It's incredibly overwhelming, and there is a very thin line between burdening the human to a level that they actually decide not to delegate this decision, or just getting incomplete decisions. And at every point in time that you are at an intersection of making a decision as an agent, essentially becomes like a coin flip. Then at the end, the decision that is made may diverge quite hugely from the initial intent of the human. Therefore, I really think that this process of the translation of the intent to what actually needs to be done for humans, for consumers, is a lot more challenging and nuanced, and it's optimizing for a lot more complex problem, as opposed to for businesses, it's potentially simpler. And if I can just give one example, when you buy, you mentioned, Benjamin, flight tickets purchases, most humans, if you talk to them and you ask them about their criteria for a flight ticket purchase, they know classes of economy, premium economy, business, and first. While there are at least between 10 to 15 subclasses, which are called the fare classes, within each of these categories of classes that people know, generally speaking, that are, you might have seen them on your ticket, but different letters of NMK, whatever. And those are very much impacting the price of the ticket, the flexibility of the ticket, the rights that you have as a buyer of this ticket, as the owner of this ticket. And all of these things are seen by the agent, and there are a lot of rules that the agent can see and even kind of predict what the next thing is going to be based on the availability of the multiple options around it. And if it comes back to you and asks you 1,000 questions, as in, okay, in terms of priority, would you rather have a heavier suitcase or a more flexible ticket that you can give back until an hour before the flight, or change it? Or like, I don't think humans would appreciate that. So I really think that we should look at the decisions in terms of the complexity. And although they may look very, very simple to us now that we make those decisions, they may not be at the end of the day when they have to be delegated.
You're making a number of really, really interesting points there. One of which is that, I think we're very used to always thinking that sort of B2B commerce is more complicated, because usually it is. But actually you're saying potentially in this context, actually B2B might actually be simpler, because a business can and probably does define what it needs in a way that we as slightly irrational, emotional human beings maybe don't. Sam, I'd love to bring you back in on some of the issues that Rory was talking about how you start to sort of think through what needs to change in the industry if you've got sort of robots, agents, sort of initiating payments rather than humans, and some of those issues like refunds and so on. Where are we getting to in terms of sort of thinking through sort of protocols, processes, standards for how agentic payments might be handled?
Well, I see it starting basically gradually, but like ultimately it requires a mindset shift. I think users will adopt agentic payments in a low risk, predictable scenarios first, like subscriptions, audio ordering. But the real shift eventually is moving from approving individual transaction to basically approving a system. Well, that makes a decision on behalf of you. Let's say we saw the boost of the Clawbot development, right? Basically, in the future, what I could do is like I could set up the rules for my bot, saying like, hey, so these are the rules. You go on based on these rules. You go and make the payments. But I think we are a bit far from there. But eventually, that change, and we will go there, and people will start thinking about controls rather than, making the payment itself or how to make the payment.
Rory, there's a really exciting future here, where there are merchants that potentially do really, really well out of agentic commerce, and everything's hunky dory, and sales are growing, and it's all good. And merchants are often quite open-minded about new payment systems because they're like, hey, this could boost our volume, and this is all good. But there's also this kind of nightmare scenario where agents start buying things that the customer didn't want, to Sahar's point, or the customer didn't know they wanted, or realized they didn't want. And then you just get this sort of wall of refunds and so on. And it's just a whole world of pain for merchants. Where are we on that spectrum at the moment?
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question. Look, I think for every one bona fide use case we can think of for using agents to do good commerce, I think there's likely 100 fraudulent ones that sit alongside them. That I'm sure Sahar and Sam would be better than I would about inventing some of those. But look, that is where we are in the industry right now. And I think as we talk about protocols, I think, Sam, we've probably got more agentic commerce protocols at the minute than we have for agentic commerce transactions, if we're honest, right? and I think it's very early days, let's be honest, right, in terms of what we're trying to do here. But again, I think we can all see where this will go. It's how we build the infrastructure to get the trust in the way that the system has to work. So, look, since Sam Altman put out his iconic Age of Agents blog in January 2025, we had Visa and MasterCard jump in with, protocols and services for how their rails would take on agentic payments. We've had the big platforms like OpenAI, announce how they would do it inside their ChatGPT, then they'll announce how they'll do it outside of their ChatGPT. We've had Google obviously announce AP2 and UCP. And look, I think that in broadly speaking, what's happening in a minute is you've got the platforms who are putting protocols around orchestration of the purchase and discoverability of the purchase. And you've got the networks and the schemes quite rightly thinking about identity, credentials, tokenization. And they're playing at slightly different levels in those kind of pieces. And I'm sure we'll talk about how we see this panning out over time. But I think what's really important is we start to put the consumer at the heart of this, and we start to put the merchants at the heart of this. And to your point, like for some businesses, the thought of opening up every single SKU that they offer to agents without any layer of their brand or any layer of their service is incredibly frightening. And that would be completely against their business model. And I think maybe what we can, whilst it's hard to predict the future, and whilst for sure these are the worst LLM models that we'll ever use, they'll only ever get better over time. What we can say is if we go back to how e-commerce started, we know that the most important thing for businesses and the most important thing for merchants was to think about their business model and then think about how they could use e-commerce or digital to accelerate it. It's the reason that IKEA had a fundamentally e-commerce proposition to Chanel. It's the reason that Amazon looked very different to eBay, because their business model drove their digital commerce strategy. And I think that what needs to happen here, obviously, is that business models need to be thought about first, and how that then wants to correlate to agentic commerce strategies. And quite frankly, one size will not fit all. We will not be doing agentic commerce exclusively inside of any AI platform. It will exist across many places across the world. And for merchants, that means they're going to have to work with players that support all these protocols in all these scenarios to support many, many business models. So again, Benjamin, it's definitely not me to predict the future, but I think that we can draw some correlation from the past for sure.
Can I add something here to on top of what Rory just said about the merchants who are not going to like this change? On the contrary, there are a lot of merchants who would really like this change, because if you think about it, branding is incredibly expensive and very, very sophisticated. It's a science of its own, and it's very, very difficult to, in this competitive market, to stay on top of the mind of a consumer. So if a company with absolutely haphazard branding and not a very well-known name does their job right in order to be identified by the agents with all the characteristics. Like I think people with a blue hat, as they say, like accountant mindset, like if you can translate the properties of what you're selling, the goods or services, into an API friendly manner, the importance of branding at that point is near zero, unless the human has explicitly mentioned a specific brand, which means that actually the point of marketing and branding is shifting through the tunnel to another point.
I think that's exactly the point. I think that the point of marketing is going to shift.
Yeah,
and you're so right, because like, look, ironically, words on a page, pictures on a page will matter less. The fundamentals of e-commerce, like pricing, availability, logistics, return, are going to be more important. And you're quite right. Like at the end of the day, the consumer is going to set the preferences for the agent.
Yep.
So you're still going to have to know the consumer, and you're still going to have to know what preferences they set.
Yeah.
But your marketing, your point of marketing will change. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. In my previous life, I used to work in a consulting firm that they also had SEO capabilities, and writing up metadata in order to be scrollable by Google was just like identifying some keywords that describe something. But just imagine if you can do that on a steroids using the techniques that exist today and describe something that is very, very interesting and easily readable for a machine. You essentially, even if you suck at branding and marketing, you may get a chance.
Indeed.
It seems like if in the past we had to work on our websites to make it more attractive, but now we don't need to even think about our websites, but rather think about the text itself only to attract the bots and AI.
So just to circle back then, are we going to need to build a new sort of liability framework, right? So I completely take your point, Rory. This is a way off. There's a lot of thinking to be done. There's a lot of just people getting used to it, and we'll see a lot of maybe agentic discovery where there's still a human in the loop for payments before we get to sort of agentic payments. But let's say at some point consumers, businesses do start getting comfortable with agents that they've given good guardrails to and so on, to buy maybe routine, replacement objects and things like that. At what point then do we then need, maybe this is to you, Sam, do we need a sort of new liability framework? Do we need a new way of thinking? What happens if there's a mistake, right? Because the agent orders the wrong thing, the customer didn't want the thing the agent ordered, maybe it's the customer's fault, right? But right now, the merchant tends to get the blame, right? Tends to get the charge back. Do we need a new framework for that?
Well, I think we need it. Yes, the current framework again assumes, as you said, explicit intent. We believe that there is a single responsible actor. I mean, for example, in my case, if I'm making a purchase, it's me, and we also expect that transaction level authorization. But agentic payments break this all three. You have continuous authorization in this case, and also decision-making chains, and there is multiple actors involved, because again, some of those actors is like the developer of the agent. So in my opinion, the system needs to move towards identity and permission boundaries and audit trails as the basis for assigning responsibility. So if we talk about liability, and I also believe that in the long term, the developers who developed the bot and agent will be more responsible when it comes to liability. And as Rory mentioned in the beginning, we also see networks trying to own the, I would say, identity layer, when they say like we will go and basically ensure that the bots or AI agents that are making the payments are trustable, or even the developers or the companies that develop these bots could be trusted. And let's see how that plays out. But in my opinion, generally, we will need a new liability framework moving forward.
We need to wrap up this first section, but to wrap it up, Rory, I love the point you made earlier, that there's potentially more sort of protocols and standards being developed than there have been agentic payments at this point. Where do you think we might see, and I take your point about predicting the future being very hard,
Yeah.
where do you think we might see agentic payments starting to be embraced first? Can you see any sectors, any countries, any transaction types where you think, yeah, this is perhaps where it's best suited so far?
Yeah, definitely. And look, we've actually spent a bit of time running survey with consumers. We've surveyed around 12,000 consumers across the globe and around 800 merchants on exactly that question, Benjamin. Like, where do they see agentic commerce actually getting traction? What are the barriers? And, effectively what types of transactions? And look, some of it is this, is like, consumers will admit, like 50%, more than 50% actually, will admit using AI to discover products today. But 48% of them are absolutely categoric that they are very nervous or feel unsafe about using full agents to conduct commerce or using agentic payments. And the top three barriers, of course, are: how do they know it's me? How do we manage returns? And how do I set the limits? Right. So that gives us a really good indication for what's on the mind of a consumer and what the industry has to work together to address in its, liability models and all those kind of pieces. So, that being said, outside of the research, we've seen that, there's a whole host of transactions that people will want to do. More often than not, people will say that they'll use agentic commerce so that they don't spend too much, actually, so they control their budgets. But we see it really being used for purchases that humans really don't want to make. And the answer to that question is different for all four of us that are on this podcast today. Some of us will enjoy making some purchases, others will hate making the same purchases. So that's what's going to happen if we were to predict the future, is that consumers are always going to use this type of technology to make payments for the stuff they don't want to make. And it's fascinating to see in the research that like more than a third of us would use agentic commerce to buy for a loved one, because we trust the agents to get it right, but we won't use them to buy for colleagues because we're worried that they'll get it wrong. So maybe that gives you an indication of the types of psyche inside the consumers and their adoption of agentic commerce.
Wonderful. That's a fantastic point. All right, we're going to take a very quick break here, and then we're going to come back and explore where the value in agentic payments sits.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
K-pop Demon Hunters Haja Boys Breakfast Meal and Huntrix Meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
Welcome back. So in the first half, we looked at agentic payments, thinking about sort of control and convenience. And now let's sort of dig in perhaps a little bit more into sort of some of the infrastructure, sort of intelligence and things like that. Sahar, let's sort of start with you. What is agentic payments? Is it a sort of a revolution in potentially in how money moves? Is it just a smarter layer on top of the same rails? What is it, do we think?
I think it's an entirely new landscape. So I don't believe that even if we can go with, for example, one of the things that today we have, which is very comparable to what agentic payments at scale will be, is systematic or programmatic advertising spend, which is a lot of real-time actions happening. It's everything is like one search word comes in, real-time bidding happens, pricing mechanisms are all very dynamic. And then at the end of the day, in a fraction of a second, one would win, and then the image would appear, and then it continues as like the eyeballs that they get and the click-throughs that they get. So it's very much of a lot of programs and systems talking to each other in order to make this ecosystem work. And I believe that at scale, when we're not talking about you and me just like automating our grocery shopping. It's more about when agents start negotiating with each other and do multiple payments at the same time, and they're at scale, like for larger scenarios, for more complex scenarios. At that point in time, this could be done exactly on the same rails as advertising, systematic advertising is being done on the same rails. At the end of the day, there's a netting that happens, or there is a escrow account that you put your first budget in at the beginning of the month, or you just get the bill like a credit that you have at the end of the month or any other period. So the rails can remain the same, but and I believe that there are a lot of players that are working on that part, introducing split stable coins or Bitcoin or any other type of cryptocurrency, and that would make it probably cheaper and faster, and perhaps the decentralization would help, or the whole systematic contracts that are perhaps even useful for the other parts of the design and development of the liability structure of the whole thing would be very helpful. But the thing is that at the end of the day, that is not the pain point. So the rails can very much remain the same. The points to Rory's point, the riskier part that today doesn't exist really, and it does. And some companies have started doing it. Visa, MasterCard, Stripe has done quite a few initiatives, and Google and Coinbase are working on it. So there are a lot of things that are happening on that front. Even some fintech companies. There is one called Trulio that they actually do, as Rory mentioned, instead of KYC, they do KYA, Know Your Agent, and it's all about the verification of the identity and the delegation, the reality and the scope of the delegation of the agent in order to make that purchase. So in terms of missing parts, there are quite a few missing parts in the top part of the layer before the layers that before we get to the payment layer and the payment rails that are a lot more urgent, and we have to entirely reimagine the whole thing, as we just discussed, where everything happens in terms of brand recognition or the description of the product or the choice or the price mechanism. All of these things are becoming a lot more of an issue than the payment rails. So I would prioritize those, but obviously there are multiple players in this space that are working on every bit of this ecosystem.
It's really interesting, isn't it? How agentic commerce and agentic payments sort of throws out everything that we sort of thought we knew, and everything that's been optimized for human beings suddenly becomes less important. You know, Sahar, you've already basically said branding's irrelevant, but so too, as you said, is search engine optimization. But the checkout. I mean, Sam, does the value shift here? Like, because it used to be like, you know, who owns the checkout? You know, there's, you know, currently there's sort of payments providers fighting to be, you know, the button in the right place on the checkout screen. But actually, over time, this would shift to like who owns the decision, who's influencing the decision, how you optimize for agents rather than optimizing for humans. Is that right? I mean, where does this go? Where does the value shift to? What do people focus on?
I think I will go back to the same example which Sahar mentioned earlier. Like you don't need to think about marketing anymore. I think the value is moving towards, again, to developers of the chatbots and AI and other interfaces. Because think about it, in the future, if you don't even have to develop the website, what as an e-commerce, let's say as a merchant, you could go to OpenAI and say like, hey guys, I have I'm selling cups or mugs, right? They are this design or that design, and then you ask OpenAI saying like, guys, do you have catalog and images of these products? What I will do from my side, I will provide the pricing, and basically you decide about the rest. And what OpenAI does is that basically says, yes, we do have catalog of these products, but you have to provide the let's say the pricing, and we will do the rest for you. At this point, it seems like now we are heavily dependent on, again, the developers of the AI platforms, which on one hand is very scary. On the other hand, it's like, okay, as a merchant, I don't have to think about developing the website, doing the marketing anymore. Maybe I can work with OpenAI closely, even help for them to help me to do the marketing. Now they launched, like, for example, ads on their platform, right? If I pay a bit more, then they would most probably move me on top of the list, let's say, in comparison to other providers. So that's why I think, again, the we are moving towards more intent layer, where we go and decide in the chats and AI chatbots.
Thank you. Rory, does this change the role of payment service providers like Checkout.com? I mean, obviously, it changes what you need to do to authenticate a payment and process a payment and so on. But does it actually change the role of payment service providers, or do you think you continue to have the same role? You're just working with robots instead of people?
I think it changes the role for this specific channel. But just to be sort of clear on some of the things we've covered there, and I'm sure Sam and Sahar didn't mean to say that branding and marketing would go away in perpetuity. It was
that was me exaggerating.
Absolutely, no, I did not say that. It
change.
just shifts.
Yeah, exactly. And I think and look, this again, let's get real, right? Like, I mean, e-commerce is let's say 30 years old. It's still only 20% of all retail sales globally. And again, we've in our research, we've asked merchants and consumers how long they think it will take to get 10% of all e-commerce to be conducted by agents, and only half of them believe that will take will be done within 2 years. So it's going to evolve, and all these channels are going to coexist. So what it means for a payment service provider like Checkout is we have to support all these digital channels in the same way that we support various evolutions in traditional channels. So, but for agentic commerce specifically, there's 4 things that we're thinking about in our conversations with merchants, and the first is this point of interoperability. Right, this is all agentic commerce is not going to happen inside of one platform, right? Like, it's going to be multiple platforms, and the plethora of platforms will grow. So, how do we ensure that merchants are able to build once to a payment provider like Checkout, and then Checkout will manage the different protocols, orchestration engines, discovery engines, identity engines on behalf of the different platforms, so that there's almost, I don't know, Sam, it sounds awfully like a payment gateway that's in this kind of agentic commerce world. So that's kind of like the first thing that we're thinking about. Obviously, identity is really important, and we've spoken already about know your agent and credentials and how all those things are managed. I think that one of the opportunities we haven't talked about that, again, payment service providers are well placed to help in this equation is around the context of tokenization and what goes into those tokens, and what can we then know about consumers, and how do they program their agents, and how do we get that data back to merchants in the form of tokens, because that is marketing gold in this agents world, right? Is knowing how consumers are actually programming these agents. That's a fabulous type of insight that marketeers and brand people would love to get hold of. And the last thing we're talking about is how people construct the visibility layer. So they're able to look at dedicated agentic purchases and manage and monitor the performance of agentic purchases, just like they manage and monitor e-commerce purchases. And all those kind of equations are on the table for payment service providers like Checkout. We are thinking about how we take the complexity out of this a little bit, and again, make it easier for merchants to engage in those pieces as the industry begins to collaborate and figure out how to solve these particular problems.
That's really, really, really interesting stuff. Sahar, I realize you can't speak for investors as a whole, but do you think investors are starting to sort of place any bets here? Do you think investors see some winners, some losers? I mean, obviously, chip makers are probably winners. But is there any sort of emerging theses among sort of investors about who potentially benefits from this, who potentially loses out from this?
As you can imagine, there is a huge amount of hype, and today that's the name of the game. As you said, chips, everyone's running after them until there is a new technology that comes out and doesn't require that much compute, and then everyone will just turn their head and find the next thing that excites them. So definitely there is so much going on in the field of fintech. The majority of generalist investors have very much focused on fintech in the past 2 years and very much shifted concentration of investments on the whole fintech area. In terms of agentic commerce, in terms of the infrastructure, one of the things that I see is that there are a lot of segregated individual, very, very small parts of this entire journey that are being built in by different companies and different ventures, and they are getting quite some attention. While I personally believe that although it's very important to solve each of these problems, potentially what they are thinking is that they are going to get absorbed by one of the big players year 1 or 2, so very early throughout the build. So I really think that the ones who are going to win are the ones who are going to design as a whole, the whole system of the liability and the insurance of this whole ecosystem, which is a whole new version. We have to entirely forget what we knew, as I said, Benjamin, and start rethinking and reimagining, which is the case for everything today. Like if you think about education, is exactly the same. If you think about any other aspects of life that will be quite significantly impacted by AI, and more specifically agentic AI that takes the agency from humans, it has to be entirely reimagined. And I think that liability layer is going to be very, very interesting in the coming years, and that's the part that myself I'm very interested in terms of identity verification, in terms of types of payments and tokenization, and the policy layer. There is a lot that is happening already, and there are quite well funded companies that are doing it. But as a whole, I would say that the governance, the overall governance layer in terms of both insurance and the liability should be like the dispute resolution part, that it has to be entirely reimagined and redesigned. Those parts, as in terms of meta thinking, in terms of the skeleton of that actually then contains all of these pieces that are being built, I think is very much missing. And in terms of the fact that we have hardly anything decided today on the liability part, it shows that the prize is going to be in that field. So I'm quite sure that as soon as every player in this entire ecosystem realizes that, instead of pushing back on taking some of the liability, they will start actually trying to cash out in it. So yeah,
that's very, very interesting. I'm interested, gentlemen, whether you agree with that point about whoever takes on the liability is potentially a winner. Sam, do you agree with Sahar's analysis there of who potentially stands to gain?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with this argument because, again, in my opinion, everyone, I mean, to a certain sense, is excited about agentic commerce and agentic payments because, again, maybe now some of the work is going to move inside the chat, and you don't have to do much in terms of, again, it's not going to disappear, marketing is not going to disappear, but it's going to shift. But on the other hand, we still do not understand who is going to be responsible if there is a mistake, right? We still are trying to understand, and in my opinion, at this point, we also should look to regulators to come up with some sort of a regulation saying in these scenarios, for example, the merchant is responsible. In other scenarios, maybe then the card provider or let's say or chatbot developer would be responsible. But in my opinion, I think these are the hot topics. Liability layer is the hot topic, and if I was a developer, if I was a founder, then I would go and start developing something in this direction moving forward.
Because at the moment, if I can add something, at the moment, the closest to reality that we have in terms of fully automated agentic commerce is like, for example, your printer, when it realizes that the supply of ink is low and it automatically reorders, or papers, or in any, like the filters in some fridges, the water filter or any other sort of parts of devices that we use are being automatically reordered. And if you look at what is actually happening today, you will realize that at the end of the day, humans in this entire ecosystem, who are the least informed of all, are being entirely liable. So if the machine makes a mistake, and there is actually a very interesting thing with I don't know if there are like Samsung fridges, that there are smart fridges, and as soon as they see that there is a supply of something in your fridge and they used to order it until the last bit, and they actually used to place the order. But just imagine that you misplace your milk, and then suddenly like 5 gallons of milk appears at your door. So it's still very early days, and now they have moved back to they give you the shopping list, and then you still have to. It's a one-click shopping, but still it's in collaboration with Amazon Fresh. I think that you can just click it and reorder. But at the end of the day, if any mistakes happens today, human, which is the least informed part of the loop, is going to be liable for it. And to me, that's not at all sustainable in scaling of agentic payments and commerce in general.
I totally agree. But I think it's interesting, like, and again, I think the way that we think about like how you establish taking on liability is the core of it, as you said, is in identity, actually. Like, you've got to be able to give parties the ability to know the identity of agent and non-agents, and who has permission and who doesn't have permission. Is the agent authorized or non-authorized? And then there has to be the audit trail of that identity, actually, as that's the cornerstone or foundation information for somebody to be willing to take on the liability in that sort of sense. So I think that, it would be a brave merchant or system or software provider or platform that would take on the liability today if the core foundations of identity, permissions, and audit trails are not there to be able to track. Because, the examples you gave of, the machine-based ordering today, the actual identity track is the consumer has put the card in the system and pressed OK to approve. And that, as you say, is causing the liability to be on the consumer. In true agentic world, we have to rethink how identity, permissions, and audit trails are given so that liability can be taken in different places.
Yeah, and MasterCard and Visa both have started doing that, the verification of agents. But again, another thing is that you have to know your agent. So it's something that the responsibility of it at the end of the day is on the human. Very funny anecdote. The very first time that I created my very first entirely automated agent as my assistant, it took me an hour to set it up, and then 2 weeks to give all of the accesses that it needed and the authorities to access this and that, my calendar and this email and there and that. And I don't think anyone who is not as technologically savvy as I am will be able to do this. So just to begin with, in order to authenticate and give all of these accesses, create all of these API keys and one-time passwords and sharing all of that with an agent in order to have that agent embedded with all the information that you require in that token to pass it on throughout the process. It's a huge responsibility, and a lot of mistakes can happen. And still, a lot of the tools that I use today, which are AI native tools, send me 100 messages and emails and phone calls. Are you sure you want to give it a read and write access to this agent? They can't believe anyone would do that. So it's if you receive funny emails from me, it's because it's all fully automated and my agent is in charge. But I really think that part of it is going to be, again, a huge amount of education and a huge amount of, at least like a lot of players will have to make that frictionless, which is a very, very big word for this point in time. Friction is going to be the least of our concerns, I guess.
All right, the time has just flown by, so we've run out of time for our discussion, which is a great shame because this is just fascinating discussion. We're clearly going to be talking about this a lot more over the next few years. Last thought, very quickly from all of you. What sort of needs to happen? What's the most important thing that needs to happen over the next few years to turn agentic payments specifically from a sort of vision into a reality, something that becomes normal? Sam, what do you think the most important thing that needs to happen over the next few years is?
I think after this conversation, it's that we need one organization or body that would control liability and say like, okay, I will take this risk and you guys can rely on me. And at that point, then everyone will start trusting more into agentic commerce and payments. This is my opinion. Other than that, it seems like the rails are already there, and we know how to make the payments. We know how to develop, let's say, bots and AI. But again, we still are concerned about liability. So I think we need to come up with a solution or one regulatory body that would take on this responsibility.
Rory, what do you think? What's the most important thing that needs to happen, do you think?
I think it's trust. Like, if I'm really honest, at a macro level, like, today, even in today's digital world, if a payment fails, 60% of consumers will not return to our website. So a failed payment or a lack of trusting payments doesn't just cost lost revenue; it costs and impacts brand value. And if you think about how we've moved from, buying in store physically goods and how we've moved online, we've spent years putting trust into that system. So the same card for the same merchant, for the same goods can be trusted online. And we have to work across the industry to ensure that consumers can trust agentic commerce in the same way they trust digital commerce. And that's, at a macro level, that's the biggest thing that has to happen.
Thank you. And Sahar, what do you think is the most important thing?
I think there is a very interesting conversation about how we are so graceful and forgiving about humans making mistakes, which are quite emotional, forgetful, incompetent beings, generally speaking. And we have zero tolerance for an agent to make a mistake. So I really think that it's a little bit of shift in thinking, as we do in asset management all the time, having an agreement signed by a human that I have X% tolerance for loss, and which is what you regularly and very commonly do in asset management. And then that would give that freedom to the agent to act on your behalf. And it's a risk-reward situation. You risk that amount, whatever percentage it is. And in terms of rewards, you can get a very convenient and comfortable process of buying or purchasing stuff. And in terms of the liability, I really think that the design of the liability has to be very much broken down. I really think that each part of the ecosystem should take the liability that is in their own remit and their own area, and there should be just a very, I would say, well-designed architecture on top that makes sure that there are no gaps in this whole process and the whole ecosystem. But I really think even AI agents themselves could be looked at as a limited liability party. We have to really think out of the box, and I really think that they could even, every time that they made the right decision, you could give them some reward, some money in their bank in a jar that they can then afterwards pay for insurance of if they made the wrong decision. So I think there are so many ways that you can do this, but in the meantime, I really think that there is a little bit of mindset shift that has to happen. And if we build the right things, I don't really believe in what surveys say. I don't think people know what they want. And I really believe that if the solution is useful enough, people trust it before they consciously start using it, before they consciously trust it.
Wonderful. That wraps up today's fascinating discussion. I've really, really enjoyed it. This has been great. I wish we'd had more time. Where can people find out more about each of you and your companies? Rory, where can people find out more about you and checkout.com?
Very simply, checkout.com. And actually, we've got a ton of, we publish all our research on consumers and thinking on early thoughts on agentic commerce and our conversations with merchants on our agentic commerce blog on checkout.com.
Sam, where can people find out more about you and Fintech Wrap Up?
Well, on my website, fintechwrapup.com or LinkedIn by typing Sam Boboev, and you can learn more about me and what I'm doing.
And Sahar, where can people find out more about you and what you're up to?
Same for me. I'm not very active on LinkedIn. I'm kind of a ghost consumer of the content, but would be always happy to discuss new ideas and exciting ventures. You can contact me on LinkedIn.
And you can find me, Benjamin Ensor, on LinkedIn. So thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed it, please do recommend us to your friends and colleagues. If you want to join the conversation, look for us on social media. Just search for 11FS or Fintech Insider, or you can email us at podcasts@11fs.com. Thank you so much for everyone for listening. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining me, and goodbye.